I'm more or less running the mental health department at PCC.
Running it.
Yes.
How many students does it have again?
At PCC?
Yeah.
It depends on which day you're talking about bots, but
Uh-huh.
it's roughly 24, I think, is what they estimated in the fall. 1,000 students, which is crazy compared to, let's say, local Cal State schools, which also run in the 25 to 28 range of 1,000 students.
But that's like a city.
But it has a very small staff. Mm-hmm.
You mean counselors, or are you talking about generally with
generally
teachers?
It's different than working at a bigger university where there's a whole department, and at PCC there is one person that you need to be on their good side to make something happen.
Oh gosh.
So it's a good stretching of my ability to sort of learn how to maneuver complicated relationships. Even if this person doesn't like me, I need them to help me do something.
Yeah, well, I mean, I went to a school that was much smaller than that.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to picture what that difference is like, what it feels like to a college student when they go on campus, partially because it's a community college, it's a different format.
Right.
But also because it's so huge.
Right.
It's going to present different problems or, just a different setup, like you're talking about. And you're talking about how like part of that is that there's this scarce resource that's felt kind of across campus maybe of like how you're actually going to get what you need from this time that you're investing in the place.
Yeah. And also there's a lot more clarifying what it is that we offer. Mm-hmm. Right. So what is mental health on a community college campus? It, first of all, looks different than like a 4-year university. Because some people are in there to get their transitional degree and move on. And then some people are coming back to community college and are taking a racquetball class. Mm-hmm. And then they still have access to our services. So trying to be equitable in terms of what we offer and trying to figure out how we can best serve people is always top of mind for us.
Yeah. Okay, so you talked about you're in charge of the mental health of this city, basically.
Yes.
And so from your perspective, I'm sure you can kind of see in general some of the tides that run through some of the concerns that are being brought in at different times of the year, let's say, or even like recently with the fires and everything like that. Mm-hmm. I think it's so important how we can see ourselves sometimes as just individuals struggling with our own individual mental health.
Right.
And although that's important, it's not the full story. I mean, I can think of for myself of how for some reason we'll just have a week where a bunch of people will reach out for the same thing.
Right.
At the same time.
It always happens like that. I don't know why that is.
I think it's kind of wonderful.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, whoa, I didn't know it, but I'm actually experiencing something that's tied into something that my neighbors are experiencing the same pain, and that we all feel this surge together. But I'm kind of curious about that for you, of how you've noticed that, especially like recently with fires.
Fires, and I would say even more, the fires, I think we will start to see the impact, at least in the counseling room, maybe in 3 or 5 months. Huh. Right now, people are embedded in their communities, right? They've got support and there's resources and there's attention and all of those kinds of things. What happens when those things start to go away and people are dealing with the lasting impacts of those things, that will be different. And that's, I think, when we will start to see this happens all the time on college campuses. An event happens and someone says, can the counseling center come and provide support for students? This happened right after the election. But it wasn't actually the election where we started to see students come in. It was after Trump took office and executive orders started rolling in, and it impacted people's lives.
Now it starts to feel real to them.
Right. And that's actually been the bigger impact, at least this winter and into the spring, has been the executive orders, the chaos, particularly around immigration, the fear in a lot of communities where students are often in mixed status families. Some of their family members are documented and others are not. And there can be just a whole variety of emotions that come from that. There are feelings of grief, fear, anger. And to your point about individualism and using therapy as like a way to kind of deal with it. If I were to tell somebody who's undocumented, well, we should really work on your anxiety about deportation.
Right.
That would just be silly. That would be absolutely silly if we didn't name the social ill that was happening that so many other people are also experiencing.
Their anxiety in that moment might be appropriate and an adaptive response to what they're going through.
Or their anger.
It's not something that needs to be pathologized or dismissed. They might need a different kind of support, but telling them to take deep breaths, for example, is the wrong
it's not
situation.
Helpful. It's funny because we will talk about like breathing, or we'll talk about meditation and mindfulness, not as a panacea, but as like you still have to go to class. And so we can do two things at the same time. We can acknowledge that you are going through something really challenging and that this is terrible. And we can use all the swear words to describe what's happening. I find that to be a very effective tool, particularly in college counseling, to name it as a fucking mess if it is a fucking mess, and to name it as racism, and to name it as institutional problematic ways of engaging with people, whether that's, nationalism that has gone awry, or all of these different things. To name those things with the client, and to say, you have to get through today. You have a test. So how can we help you manage in this moment?
Wow. Validating
your frustrations, your anger, while at the same time helping you navigate. So really not pathologizing.
Yeah.
And naming. And I think, I'm also a training director for up and coming therapists. And one thing that I find with early career therapists or practicum therapists in training is that sometimes they're either a little too gung-ho and only want to name those things, or they don't name those things enough. And so finding a way to be with our students in the moment and say, like, yes, this is real. And you have to live your life. It's a tricky balance.
That is really tricky. And I can imagine someone in that situation, especially somebody like a young adult, going, but you don't understand, this is really affecting me.
Right.
And that's hard, because what I see as I go, I think maturity is being able to balance those things and going, you know what, life doesn't stop when something bad happens. It keeps going.
Right.
And I was talking to actually one of the people at Fuller, the School of Psychology, who does academic accommodations requests.
Sure.
And she was talking about how, like, if we start accommodating for all these things that kids feel like they need, they may not be able to see down the road of what they're setting themselves up for.
Sure.
Where now they're delaying their class. Now they're in kind of independent study, where they're having all their assignments at different times than their classmates.
Right.
And where does that leave them? But I think that's just one example of going, there's this understandable need of their anxiety. And what does it mean to be like a good parent in that moment who goes, I know you don't want to go. We got to go. But here, let's make it okay for you. Easier for you.
Yeah.
It's going to be okay.
Right.
And shepherding through that, I think there's something that needs to be balanced between the both. But I think you're right, where I hear that too, with on one hand going, suck it up. This is a college, for example.
Yeah.
We're not going to hold your hand.
Right.
On the other hand, going, whatever you need, we're almost like we feel so guilty about saying no to you.
Right.
That we're not even going to challenge what you say at all.
Yes.
Sure, take all the time you need. And then where does that leave the student, if we care for them? I don't know.
Right.
I think it's a hard balance.
It's an incredibly hard, I think it's one of the trickiest things for, I think, colleges in general to manage. But for college counseling centers, the way that we see it, for example, we see, we always have crisis hours that are available to students, right? They can identify themselves as being in crisis and they can come into our office. Well, what does sometimes we'll get the question, what is a crisis? And our front desk staff are fantastic, and they've like been trained to talk about, well, could be a panic attack, or it could be, you're having some thoughts of suicide or whatever. But ultimately you have to decide if you're in distress, if you are in crisis. And in some counseling centers, the response is immediate. Okay, we're going to meet with you as soon as, like, you just sit there. I'm going to go find somebody right now to meet with you. Well, that doesn't really, even with somebody being available for crisis, we want them to sit down and we want them to fill out some paperwork for us. We want to know a little bit about them before they like come into our office. Just some basic stuff. We want to know some questions about, are you feeling suicidal? Those kinds of things. And sometimes there's someone ahead of them who's also in crisis. And so they're going to need to moderate and manage. And it's always a really interesting thing when somebody comes in and says that they're in crisis. And then we say, we don't have an available appointment until, an hour from now because we've got 2 people ahead of you. Well, I've got class in an hour. Can I come back after that? Sure. Absolutely. You can absolutely do that. But there's like a built-in like moderation and learning like distress tolerance in that. Uh-huh. I think at PCC, I've had the benefit of having some people who I work for who allow me to run the center in a way that feels appropriate for me, which includes helping students moderate their distress in that way and not being quite so reactive to students' distress.
Reactive to students' distress, because one thing that I wonder about with what has shifted culturally mm-hmm. is how students or young adults experience distress mm-hmm. differently now. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's just making a culturally blanket statement. I'm not sure.
Sure.
But I'm kind of curious how you experience that. What do you observe about the way that somebody, who's a young adult, what latent fears or maybe fragilities they hold in their world or their perspective that might be different from maybe your or my perspective generally? I'm curious about that, about what is different for some of these students in terms of the world that they grew up in and how that ends up informing how they experience their own distress or how they experience their own anxiety.
I think that culturally, and there's far smarter people that have written books about this than me, but we live in an economy of attention, right? And so even when I tell my 10-year-old that he can't have a smartphone, and probably not till he's in high school, well into high school probably, and he's just like devastated, I know that the phone will become something, it vies for my attention, right? So like, why wouldn't it vie for his attention? Mm-hmm. And so the students that I see, a lot of times we're so used to instant gratification, right? We're used to being able to text something to someone and we kind of expect a response pretty quickly. We're used to celebrities being more accessible. We're used to politicians being more accessible, kind of used to everything being more accessible, and that everything is sort of provided, information is provided to us relatively quickly. And so it's tricky when you're trying to explain to somebody the process of therapy, which is not a quick process. It's often the case that students come in and they're experiencing some sort of depression, anxiety, whatever. And we need to talk about their family growing up and how they understand themselves in the context of their family. And that's not a one session discussion, nor is it even sometimes even appropriate in the context of our short-term therapy model.
They might not even see it related specifically to what they're coming in for. When you go, hey, well, let's talk to me about your family.
Right.
I wonder if it's harder for them to tolerate, to go like, okay, this isn't going to be like a one session thing, or you're not going to feel the result immediately, but you're going to have to kind of trust me here.
Right.
Of what we're actually going to explore together.
Right. That's very difficult. I think that's difficult for anybody to understand, but I think particularly in an age where I was talking with one of our other therapists today about this. And she said, when we were growing up, like if we wanted to watch a movie, we'd have to go to Blockbuster and maybe it was out, and you didn't get to watch that movie that week because it was gone.
There's
Whereas
like 3 copies
yeah.
X movie or whatever,
And I think about my kids and their access to streaming.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it's a totally different experience. And that doesn't mean that they're like weaker or less than.
Yeah.
It comes with a different set of things. And I think one of those things is we as a culture struggle to manage our expectations and the immediacy of results.
Yeah.
And therapy is not, I think when it's done well, it's actually not usually a quick process because you can't rush the process of learning about yourself and understanding yourself and learning how to be with yourself. That's not something that just happens in the therapy room. It happens in the weeks, in the intervening times between sessions, right? So it is a process. And so
you're saying that they're used to being able to, let's say, want something and maybe have it more readily at their fingertips. And so something you see is that sometimes students where they engage with therapy, not quite maybe at first recognizing how the process is going to unfold for them, what they're going to have to explore, how much they're going to have to trust you as a therapist to kind of get them through that. And so it's so easy for them, I'm sure, to go, well, never mind, I gave therapy a try or something like this. I don't know what it's like for them.
Sometimes it's that. Sometimes on the best days, it's just a revelation. We get to the end of 8 sessions and they say, I couldn't believe that we were going to go to all these places together. That's my favorite outcome, right? Most of the time, they don't really tell me
explicitly.
Yeah, they just don't show up anymore. Like, well, you missed 2 sessions in a row and, oh, shoot. Okay. Or don't pick up the phone or whatever. But yeah, I do think that in college counseling, there is a tension around that immediacy, right? So some colleges meet that immediacy need by partnering with there's a million different programs that people are marketing, right? Whether it's telehealth options where you have the option to text a therapist immediately and have a response. And I think, well, I'll share my reflection about that in a second, but you can have access to somebody rather quickly. You can have access to information very quickly. You can solve your problem very quickly. I think I'm a relationally oriented therapist. Relational psychodynamics are my bread and butter. It's really hard to imagine removing the relationship from the importance of like healing in any context, whether we're talking about panic attacks or we're talking about symptoms of depression, just being able to get out of bed or suicidality, like any of the things that we're talking about. It's, to me, the relationship with a therapist is the powerful thing. And that's not fed in a quick texting relationship. That's built over time.
Yeah.
Sharing and hearing back from the therapist. It's a back and forth.
Just to tie that back into what you were saying about the Eaton fires.
Sure.
Something that it seemed like you were recognizing about trauma is that the trauma isn't necessarily only in the event itself. Let's say when the fires burn something or it threatens to burn something close to your house or a neighborhood that you're familiar with. It doesn't just happen in, for example, the breakup or in the loss of the family member. What you said right there is like, sometimes you don't see them coming in because they're still plugged into their relationships, into their community. And it's only when that is taken away, when those things come away, that they end up fallen apart or something feels really off inside, that feels like it flips what I think most people expect when they think about trauma, or they think about something, about when they're actually needing, or what they're actually needing help for, which is that it's not just about, let's say, the fire. It's about this larger container that I have in my community or in my closest relationships not being sufficient enough to hold this pain that I'm going through. And so there's something that starts to cry out in me that feels like a different understanding. So one would be, seeing trauma as like, okay, this event happens to me, and so I'm traumatized by it directly. The other one would be, this event happens and I start looking around for, where are my supports and how am I being held together in the middle of this? And when that is not sufficient for the experience, then something kind of falls apart. But I'm just connecting with that, with what you're saying here about relationships, about how they don't realize that what they're actually needing is some kind of relationship that's going to help them through this traumatic experience.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in that, like, ideally we would work ourselves out of a job, right? Like that therapy in the modern age, I think, this is controversial, is a substitute for community.
Yeah, say more about that.
Well, I think that our role comes out of, it could have been priests, pastors, shamans, like tribal communities, let's say, where elders served as people who provided guidance, wisdom, space, perspective to other people. And that doesn't exist in our modern society quite in the same way. I think people try, right? And to your point, in these moments of trauma, especially when it's a collective trauma, when everybody is experiencing the same thing, it's hard to find that same source of support, particularly in the current age. And I think that's why we exist as therapists. We're sort of this weird, what's the analogy? Like putting your finger in the dam, like the little Dutch boy putting their finger in the dam. Like we're plugging a hole that it was created by whatever modernity or because community was insufficient to meet the needs of people to process traumas.
It's like there's this loose fabric, right? That people fall through, whereas let's say a couple hundred years ago, I don't know what time period you want to put on it, where there were a lot more stable communities,
right? Where
you knew somebody from the moment that they were born until the moment, that maybe throughout your whole life, these people, what is the resource that we end up being able to hold together when we're in that kind of space? And then when you take that away, what's the result?
And to be clear, I don't want to say like that we're only these like plugs in the breakage of society. I think that, and I don't want to overly glamorize things of the past either, because I think that we can do that too, and that gets us into trouble. But yeah, I think there was a loss somewhere along the way in the creation of modern life where we separate from our communities more often in search of jobs or better pay or whatever opportunity.
Even though, let's say, you would have had different mental health problems,
right,
in the eras past, but today, additionally to those problems, you also have these kind of issues of a lack of a communal structure that can smooth over some of these traumas, or that they can be processed together in a different way.
Right.
And if you don't have that, if you don't have a stable family structure, or you don't have a church community, or you don't have even like a vibrant hobby where you're getting together with other people all the time, and you're all going through something together where you can talk about it face to face, then where does that leave most people? And where does that leave most, young adults,
Right.
where they're growing up. I think about what's the difference of you and I, where we inherited a smartphone in, let's say, high school or college,
Or 20,
or 20 in your
20s.
20s,
post marriage.
Right.
Yeah,
so but when you inherited a smartphone at that age, and we already had these experiences earlier on, and then I think about kids who grew up in pretty silent hallways or in pretty silent streets, where you go down a neighborhood street and there's no kids outside playing basketball or connecting with each other, and these are the kids who you see at PCC, and I just wonder how is their world different than my world from having that experience. I'm sure there's some things that are the same. Yeah. But when they come into something like a therapy office, or even when they're just trying to navigate their normal struggles day to day, what is their world like that's different than mine? I'm curious about that.
Well, so there's the distress tolerance, right? Like,
yeah,
when I was a teenager and I needed to call my mom to come pick me up, I would have to go find a payphone and call collect and say my name as like, Mom, I'm at this, such and such place, come pick me up, and then hang up, right? That's how you got somewhere.
Yeah.
And you would have to, or you'd go into a store and you'd say, hey, can I use your phone? Or you would talk to the principal and say, hey, my mom didn't come pick me up. There was a lot more communication with other people in your community as a result. And there's a lot of reasons why people have aversions to talking on the phone. I get it. Like, I don't want to answer a phone call from somebody I don't know either. But it means that sometimes asking for help from actual people is in and of itself like a stressor or really difficult. So getting people to come in, what I tell students is, you've already done this thing where you've come in and you said, I need help. That is a huge step in just asking for help. And for a lot of these students that are younger, that are kids, that is a hard step for them, because we don't have a texting line. They can't text us their problems. They can send an email, but in order to set up the appointment, they have to call our office or they have to walk in. So they have to do this interactive piece with us in order to make the appointment to come in. And that is outside of their comfort zone. That's different, I think, than you and I. Like, I remember feeling anxious when I would call a doctor's office or something like that when I graduated high school and I was doing it for the first time. But I don't think I had nearly the same anxiety, because I was used to asking for help. There was that was a normal part of life, which I don't think that kids right now feel in the same way. Because so many things you can set up via text or online or whatever. I find myself annoyed when I gotta call them to set up an appointment. Jeez, and you lose the act of asking for help.
Asking for help is different for them. And it feels like a huge weight. And I still wonder, okay, so how do they picture their world differently? And the thing that I kind of think about is that most of their interactions, I'm guessing, the most vibrant social connection they have is this digitally mediated one. Where
sometimes,
that's I remember Bo Burnham in his, did you see that
yeah,
Inside?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, brilliant.
Yeah.
It's interesting. He's I think if I'm right, he's the first YouTube video to go viral.
Way back when?
Way back when.
Oh, interesting.
So when YouTube was first getting online, it was viral was a new phenomenon that would happen, where one video would get a lot of attention.
Right.
And his went viral for some music video he made inside of his bedroom. And that's why he became a comedian, is because he got all this traction. But he has a lot of reflections about what it means to be in this digital life, and the way that these companies are aggressively targeting especially younger people, and in the same way that maybe Kellogg's might target, or McDonald's might target kids to try to shape their taste for having Big Macs, later on, in the same way that internet companies are going to be targeting and saying, this is the way you're going to socially engage because we can monetize it, we can mediate it, all those things. And then I think what ends up getting lost in the shuffle, one of the things I think about is going, when I was a kid, there was a lot of like really good independent kind of risk-taking things that I might do, for example, start a band or even try, selling lemonade. That'll be maybe when I'm younger, start selling lemonade. But these things where you go, I'm going to like try something out on my own and see what I've got inside, I'm going to see what I'm made of. And I wonder about what that looks like differently for a young adult. Maybe it looks like trying to get something to go viral, or it looks like trying to start a social media account. I'm not sure what that looks like for them, but I do know that it's kind of an impulse at that age to try to explore and to do something on your own.
Sure. Which I think, I don't want to reduce the stories, the varied stories of many different people at community college to one thing, or even college in general, the different colleges I've worked at. But I think there's a lot more savviness about the hustle that I am not as attuned to. I am not a hustler at all. Like, it's part of the reason why I went into college counseling in the first place. It was like, all my clients are going to come to me and I don't have to work to, there's something about like being in private. I've always admired you and like what you do, like, cause you gotta like hustle to get people to notice, and to value the thing that you bring. College kids are hustlers. Like they are, and they sort of know it. I think that's different. Like there's a side gig is always going to be part of their concept and their discussion. So in that way, they're a little bit more resilient, I think.
Savvy too.
Savvy.
They I think about my brother-in-law, and he's 21, and he seems to have a much deeper understanding of the kinds of things that are possible on the internet or with a social media account,
right,
than I do.
Right.
It's like it's a whole video game that he's like on level 20 on, that I'm like on level 1 or
like
2,
trying to figure out the buttons still.
Yeah, but there's a hustle there. I think they kind of have a better sense intuitively of what you can do or how you can manage something like that,
right,
to build something.
Right. So in that way, I think risk taking, to your earlier statement, it takes a different form. Sometimes that means that because maybe there's like a struggle to interact interpersonally, risk taking is just like talking to someone, right? In therapy, and especially in short-term therapy, you're trying to build skills rather quickly. And so often I wouldn't say it's homework, but it's like, what if you tried this week to go and talk to 3 people and see how that goes, right? Or what if you said that you were interested in such and such club? What if you went and joined a meeting this week? Like, I know that they meet on Tuesdays at, in this place. And that's a risk for them. Whereas that might not have felt quite so risky for me in college. But I don't even know that that's all that different, to be honest. Like if I think about how college students have always, or have been in the time that I've been working with them, 12, 13 years.
Well, if we could back up there of going just for people who maybe either have a young adult, or even are a young adult, of what are some things that you point to when you think about that developmental stage, about what is so important for them in that moment? What are they trying to do? What are they behind the scenes, kind of, even if they don't know it, trying to accomplish for themselves, even by going to PCC,
right,
or by hustling? Or what is the driving force for somebody in that age range about what they're trying to do with their life?
I don't have anything revolutionary to say other than like independence, right? Which is what we've known. All of our well-read theorists of over the years have said, like, this is the age of independence. It is, right? And so one of the things that we'll see in college counseling spaces is often what happens when I'm not independent enough. It is crazy to me. It never fails to amaze me when I see college students, from the caveat being families who have means, right? Who come in and don't have their driver's license. That's just like wild to me, because as a 16-year-old myself, I was like, when's the test? When can I take it? What job do I need to do in order to like make sure that because it gave me freedom. It gave me independence, those kinds of things. That was what I was looking for. So many college students don't do that. However, I will say, kind of thinking of both like a strengths-based approach as well, the college students at PCC can navigate public transit like nobody's business. It is so impressive in a way that I never could have. And it was always a little bit terrified to do so. So, it's not all bad, but that's one of those things that it is always striking to me when I see, again, students who come from families where they could have afforded to get their driver's license, choosing not to. That always seems to me like a breakdown of the independence piece, where I'm constantly still dependent on mom and dad to get me everywhere I need to go, which limits my ability to try something new or even have a job in a different place or time than my parents are comfortable with, or things like that.
Right. Independence. So it's like they're pushing out from maybe what their life has been like before, where let's say they live at home, and maybe they still might live at home, but like let's say they're coming from high school. Not that everyone at PCC, there's plenty of people who come in from lots of different age ranges, but in general, they're coming from some place where, let's say they're more dependent on their larger family, and they're trying to grow something within themselves to get a larger skill, to be able to try out the world on their own terms in some way, to decide to do something on their own. I can think of a client where she graduated high school, and she was kind of told to go to community college by her family. And it was, even though community college ended up being an important step for her, the first step was her being able to decide that this is what she wanted to do on her own terms.
Sure.
Because if not, then you end up maybe being in this kind of tug of war relationship with your parents in some way. But I think about that when you say independence, of going, almost like, what are the questions that they're trying to ask themselves when they sign up for classes, or when they come into therapy, or when they're trying to make friends? I kind of imagine something along the lines of, what do I have to offer to the world, and who am I, and where do I belong? Right. Which is kind of an extension of adolescence in some ways, Yeah. But definitely in this more heightened, and I think more tenuous place of them really taking a risk and trying something out on their own.
Right. And I think that's, to loop back to what we were talking about before, I think it's why it's so important that colleges strike this careful balance between holding students to account in certain ways, and having boundaries and having expectations and those kinds of things, but also providing a safe place to explore and try on these different things with hopefully impact that isn't going to affect them lifelong, right? Because I've been in plenty of college counseling spaces, particularly at the university level, where if you fail a class, like maybe you don't get to go on to do the major that you had really, well, what if you just had a shitty semester, right? Like, so colleges can be this launching place to great effect, I think, of creating like a safe place for exploration and independence and all of those things, but have outside pressures, I think, to either be too accommodating or too rigorous, and can really hurt students in that process.
Yeah. Have you heard about or read Abigail Schreier's Bad Therapy?
No.
Oh man.
The title sounds great though.
Well, I'd be curious to know your thoughts. I'll kind of outline maybe what she posits. But she goes, she feels like therapy has specifically failed young people. She, I think it comes out of her own, maybe, I don't want to speak for her here, but I think it comes out of her own experience of having a daughter who's in therapy.
Yeah.
She's not a therapist herself, but she's done a lot of research about the efficacy of therapy and going, what her criticism is that therapy is navel gazing and that it's, this kind of maybe more enmeshed relationship that's about dependence on the therapist and isn't helping challenge the person to become who they need to become independent, to become sufficient to handle challenges. And her impression of therapy from speaking with her own child's therapist and speaking with other therapists is that it's pacifying to people and going, well, name your feelings on a chart.
Right.
Oh, you can say you feel sad. Good. We're good to go.
Right.
I'm so glad you feel close to me, kind of thing. And then they almost develop an identity around themselves as being I have anxiety.
Right.
I have depression. I go to therapy. And that becomes part of their self-concept in this kind of more morose place. I feel like there's validity to some of what she's saying, and that is a welcome criticism. But I wouldn't say that's what we want to paint all of therapy as, of going, well, maybe that is bad therapy, but it's not what it means for something to be therapeutic, or for a relationship to be therapeutic, or for a therapist to be therapeutic. But I don't know what your immediate thoughts are.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've bumped into some of that. Have you?
Yes. And I think that there is bad therapy out there. I do think that therapy that fosters so much dependence in the relationship that the client isn't making steps towards any kind of growth. And growth is loosely defined. I think that's part of the problem with some of the efficacy studies, is that, well, what do we define as effective for a person? That being said, I do think that, like, if we wrap our identities around depression, anxiety, those kinds of things, I think that can be problematic, because we become stagnant in that identity, right? Identity is always meant to change and grow. Who I am as a 40-year-old woman is not who I was as a 30-year-old woman. And so much has happened in 10 years. If I was the same and I identified myself in the same way, and therapy didn't help me grow, and I actually have had the same therapist from 30 to 40. But if her view of my well-being was for me to just feel safe and secure in what I think right now. Yeah. Right. Because I think that's what the criticism is like, what you think and feel right now not only is valid, but is capital T truth. Yes. For you. And that's just not how the world works.
Right. But I think that can be sometimes, for some therapists, their bread and butter.
Yes.
Of my job is to validate. If I validate well enough and repeat back to you what you're saying, you're going to feel good. Right. And her criticism is going, no, that's left my daughter and me and other people stuck in a pit. Right. And yet I think it's hard for therapists to picture, let alone clients, to picture, okay, well, what is a bigger vision of what we're trying to help, for example, young adults do? Right. If it's not to just help them feel safe and secure, which is important. Right. But if that's not the end, but kind of the starting block, then what are we actually trying to grow in a person when they come in, not just a PCC counseling center, but when they actually engage in an institution like PCC or as a young adult? What are they actually trying to grow into? They probably are wanting to be challenged. That's why they sign up for these classes. Right. They want to reach the limit of what they can do and what they know, and to have to figure out how they're going to meet the moment. And I think that's a bit different of an understanding of development than I think maybe what some kind of maybe shallow view of therapy is, of like, I'm just going to validate you, and we're going to check what feeling on the chart that you have today, and then I feel really good as a therapist, right? Because we cross something off, and we're vibing, right? Like, we're vibing in the session. You feel good because you're feeling great, and I'm feeling good because I feel like I'm helping, and that's all that needs to happen. It can be hard, because then you go, I think there's a way as a therapist where you want to stay close to that. You don't, you know, there, if you're not grounded in some kind of vision about this person's development, what I'm actually trying to do for them, it can be easy to kind of go, well, I'll just kind of say the thing that makes you feel comfortable or safe.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Well, and one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing, because as with most college counseling centers, we do this too. We do short-term therapy, which means that for many people, the type of therapy that we provide is insufficient for what people need, which means that I do a lot of psychoeducation about what is it, how do you know that you're in a good therapy relationship, right? So I've been very proud of the work that we've done at PCC's Mental Health and Wellness Center, because we provide what we call case management, but it's not just in the way that we think about social workers, like providing referrals. It is that, but it is also developmentally stepping with them through the process. So for example, if they've never made a phone call before, okay, we're going to make the phone call together in the office, and you're going to feel really awkward and uncomfortable, but then we're going to process what that looked like and that felt like at the end of it. So we do all of that, but we also talk about like, okay, so you set up an appointment with that therapist. How do you know that it feels right for you? Oh, I don't know. Okay, well, let's talk about what kinds of questions you can and should ask of the therapist. And if after 3 or 4 sessions, it doesn't feel like it's meeting the need that you, and let's talk about what that need is, right? Like, because we're going through an intake process and we're discussing what they're hoping to get out of treatment. Then maybe it's time to come back and we'll help you connect to somebody else. That's in a best case scenario, obviously, but that's the vision, is to educate people about what it feels like to be in a good therapeutic space. And one of the things that I hear often is somebody who comes in and says, I know I need long-term therapy, but I had this really like terrible experience with therapy in the past. Either, you know, the therapist, I've heard just brutal stories of therapists who are highly enmeshed, sharing their own problems with their clients, or just aren't able to take them to a deeper level. And the client can't articulate necessarily what it is that they're missing, but I can hear that it's like, it's very surface level, or we just talked about my academics or my relationship, but the therapist was never able to help them make connections to patterns in their life or any substantial way of understanding themselves so that they can continue to grow. And that's the problem with the vibing therapist, is that it is thin and it becomes kind of rancid at the end, right? Like it doesn't, everybody's just kind of sitting in their own filth, like and not like learning how that validation, that security can empower them to take risks, to do those developmental tasks that we know people need to do, particularly for young adults, needing to explore, needing to try things independently and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I wonder how much, and that I really like this term, vibing therapist. You know, that gives me such a clear picture in my mind. But I go, you know, I think there's a temptation for a vibing therapist to go, that world out there, it's really dangerous. But here with me, we're good. Safe. We're so safe and warm. I understand you. Right. I validate you.
Which is really narcissistic on the therapist part, right? Because it says more about what the therapist needs than the therapist being attuned to what the client needs. But plenty of therapists.
The therapist is needing to feel like an all-embracing mother or father who's so powerful to this person that they can just fix any wound with their understanding.
Right.
And that's really, really great for about 45 minutes. You know,
establishing that at the beginning is fine. Yeah.
For 45 minutes within that therapy hour, that can feel good to both the therapist and the client. And then the client leaves and goes, no, don't go. Right. You know, and then where does it leave them? Right. You know, it's kind of like let's say in parenting, I think we're familiar with this, with the difficulty with sleep training your kid.
Sure.
Because you want them to sleep in bed. You want to be the big mom or the big dad who comforts them and who can make all their problems go away if they just come snuggle in bed again.
Right. Feels so good.
I don't want you to grow up.
Yeah.
You know, I want you to stay right here with me.
Mm-hmm.
Therapists aren't immune from that same temptation.
No, it's actually one of the things that I try to educate people about, right? Is that one of the questions you should be asking your therapist is, are you in therapy? Because inherently it's going to be flawed. We are flawed. We have blind spots. We have things that we need to continue to work on. And clients need to ask their therapists, are you doing your own work? Have you been doing your own work? Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit about that? And I think that's important. It's one of those important disclosure moments. I tend to, like I said, I tend to be a more dynamically oriented therapist, which means I tend to sit back a little bit more. I tend to be a listener a little bit more, a little bit less directive. However, I talk a lot about with the therapists that I train, the importance of self-disclosure, particularly in college counseling. There are important moments of self-disclosure that ease the therapeutic relationship forward. And one of those things is talking about, like, if the client asks you a question about not challenging your credentials or anything like that, but challenging, like, who are you to speak to me about doing work if you haven't done it yourself? Mm-hmm. And I think, man, it's a hard truth that I think as therapists, we have a hard time swallowing. Like, there's a lot of therapists that I know that haven't done their own work, and it makes me really sad.
Yeah. Well, and then what we're talking about there too, you go, how much more are you going to end up unknowingly leaning on your clients?
Absolutely.
And vicariously trying to get those same moments for yourself with your clients when the exact opposite is needed. You know, our clients count on us to be fully available to their developmental needs in those moments. In the moment,
yeah.
You know, and if we're not in our own work, then how much more are do we end up kind of making a mess of our own therapy sessions?
And that's how you get the vibing therapist, right? The vibing therapist is somebody who is struggling to know their own identity and their role in the therapy relationship and the dynamics that are present in the relationship. And they are struggling with boundaries and all of those things that unknowingly they're unwittingly potentially hurting their clients.
This is, I think, a real challenge, especially for therapists who have become therapists because they've been told their whole life, you're so good at this. You're such a natural therapist. You're always this way with all of your friends. You ought to do this professionally. And they may not be aware. And for people listening who aren't therapists, this is the therapist personality, right? Is that for a lot of us, we were doing that with our own families because it served a function for us.
Right. It was protective in some way.
Protective. It made me feel safe to be able to listen to mom and dad or to be accommodating and to manage the conflict. And what happens when that person, if they're not aware of that wound and how it's functioned for them, comes into the therapy relationship, how much, if they're not doing their own work, it's going to affect you as the client, you know, who's in therapy, where you're in this kind of enmeshed situation because the therapist might be enacting something in their own history with you rather than being conscious of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to over and over and over again tell people, like, there are plenty of bad therapists out there. Just because they have the letters behind their name or they say therapist, you still have to do, and this is the heartbreaking part, right? When I have sat with somebody and listened to their story and then determined that what they need is something beyond what I can give them in this space, to then shepherd them through and hand them off to somebody else. And I don't always know that that person is going to be safe for this person. And it's painful and it's frustrating, a frustrating state of affairs in the profession. But also trying to, again, educate clients about how they can start to read that for themselves.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that the clients, if you're looking for therapy, your own intuition will tell you in that first phone call about how much you sense that the therapist needs you.
Right.
You know, like the neediness that you kind of sense. But I don't know that there's any specific language to pick up on. For this is what I tell people, but like, but to more just think, you know, how comfortable do I feel talking with them? A lot of times, even that simple question can speak a lot to whether this is the right person for you or whether it's a good therapist or not. You know, much more than their credentials, much more than their picture or whatever else. Just to talk to them on the phone and to see what it feels like, how comfortable, good you feel talking with them.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much about the therapy process that I think, again, I'll bring it back to the work that I'm doing as a college therapist, college counselor. There's so much that we have to educate people about, that it's okay to, I'm going to say something, but I don't mean like therapist hopping, but it's okay to, sometimes you outgrow your therapist. Sometimes the therapist has been a good enough object in the moment. And now you need something different, or you don't need something right now, but maybe you will in 5 years, and you come back to therapy again, and maybe it's with the same person and maybe it's not. But that concept of therapy as being unique, we often get lumped into the medical model, right? Like that we're doctors. You and I are both doctors, like, but we're not doctors in the way that my general practitioner is a doctor. And so sometimes we lack the language to talk about these complex processes, and we want to boil it down to something very simple and concrete. And getting to expose people to the complexity that therapy is and the complex growth that they can experience from therapy is one of the great joys of getting to do college counseling, actually, because you get these people who are doing it for the first time.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
Well, I appreciate what you're doing there. And again, I think about it being like a city where you go, what kind of weight that is for not just you, but for the counseling center to hold together about just the whole community and what they're going through. But yeah, I appreciate the work you do, and it's great to talk with you about this.
Too.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.